Coming in at 5, Cannibal Holocaust. Released in 1980 and directed by Ruggero Deodato, this movie centers on a rescue mission into the Amazon rainforest, which results in a surprising discovery when a professor stumbles across lost film shot by a missing documentary crew, whose goal was to study the region's indigenous cannibalistic tribes. Now, Cannibal Holocaust was one of the very first found footage horror movies, which actually led to the director being arrested for suspicion of murder. Now, what makes this movie so disgusting is the fact that actual animals were killed on screen, making the fake deaths of the humans more believable. In order to sell the illusion, the actors' contracts prevented them from appearing in any other TV shows or movies for a year after its release, in order to sell the fact they were supposed to be dead. Now, this eventually came back to haunt the director, who was arrested by Italian authorities shortly after the movie's premiere in Milan on charges of obscenity and suspicion of making a snuff film. The director was forced to demonstrate the movie's special effects, as well as confirm that the actors were in fact still alive. The real animal killings, however, still led to the film being banned by the authorities, a judgment that was echoed by Australia, Norway, Finland, and New Zealand. Coming in at number 4, Salò or 120 Days of Sodom. This movie, released back in 1975, centers on a group of fascists who round up 9 adolescent boys and girls and subject them to 120 days of physical, mental, and sexual torture. The movie as a whole is a metaphor for fascism and abuse by the state. The movie is perhaps one of the most disturbing and horrifically explicit movies of all time. It's the type of movie you watch on accident and never return to again. You may even talk to a therapist about it, like me. For decades after its release, it was banned in the United Kingdom and New Zealand, and was mostly banned in Australia up until 2010. Now, although it was never explicitly banned in the United States, it was involved in the arrest of the owners of a Cincinnati-based bookstore in 1994, after police bought the movie as part of a questionable sting operation. The case, however, was dismissed before a court could determine if the film violated obscenity laws. As of right now, the movie is available in a high-definition transfer from the Criterion Collection, but I implore you not to watch it. Honestly, it shook me to my core. Coming in at number 3, The Human Centipede 2 Full Sequence. The Human Centipede 2 is notorious for being one of the most disgusting films of all time, not to mention having one of the most foul-smelling concepts, as well as a decreasing level of artistry throughout the installment. However, number 2 takes the cake for being one of the most abhorrent and nihilistic movies I have ever watched in my entire life. It is beyond gross out, it is mentally and emotionally scarring. The film centers on a depraved man who goes on a killing spree in order to recreate the experiment portrayed in The Human Centipede. The movie itself was so extreme that the film was initially refused classification by the BBFC, saying, I quote, "No amount of cuts would make the movie acceptable enough to be exhibited or sold." They also raised the possibility that the film could be in violation of the nation's Obscene Publications Act, which the director Tom Six responded to, I quote, "Apparently I made a horrific horror film, but shouldn't a good horror film be horrific? My dear people, it is a f***ing movie." The movie was eventually approved for release after undergoing 2.5 minutes of cuts. The movie as it stands is banned in New Zealand, however the third movie wasn't banned anywhere at all, surprisingly, and I think that's just because it was Coming in at number 2, Necromantic 1 and 2. Directed by Jörg Buttgereit and released in 1987, Necromantic follows a street sweeper who cleans up after grisly accidents, and after he brings home a full corpse for him and his wife to enjoy sexually, he is dismayed to discover his wife prefers the corpse over him. Savage. Now, this film, aside from our number 1 point, is perhaps the most disgusting movie out there, with the movie containing acts of necrophilia and animal cruelty in abundance. Now, unlike a lot of movies on our list, these disturbing moments had a purpose, but still, it was tough to swallow, considering these scenes of sex with corpses were used to creatively further a story of elite oppression and class struggle. Due to this, the movie was banned in Iceland, Norway, Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand, Finland, Australia, and a handful of provinces in Canada. Now, the film itself was actually made specifically to protest government censorship, but despite this, the movie faced no real opposition in its home country of Germany until sales became restricted a few years later. Although the reaction from German authorities to the first Necromantic was relatively muted, the release of the sequel, Necromantic 2, certainly made up for it, with the authorities raiding theatres that screened the movie and confiscated prints, making any possession of the film a punishable act. And finally coming in at number 1, a Serbian film. Released in 2010, a Serbian film follows an aging porn star who's struggling to provide for his family. So he agrees to make one last film. Unbeknownst to him, it contains themes of pedophilia, necrophilia, and may end with his death. A Serbian film has over time gained a reputation worldwide for being one of the most extreme and disturbing horror movies ever made, and I can confirm it is horrific. Some of the most horrific moments include the assault of a newborn baby, sex with corpses, and the assault of the protagonist's own child, and that is me putting it tamely. This film is absolutely revolting and should be witnessed by no one. Saying that, it is not surprising in the slightest that it has been banned in Germany, Norway, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Spain, and Singapore, with the countries that allowed for the movie's release requiring the movie to undergo censorship cuts, and a lot of them. Following a Serbian film's ban in Spain, the director of a film festival faced criminal charges for daring to show the movie, with the accusation being that the screening constituted exhibition of child pornography. The case was such an overreach in general that the film's director claimed, I quote, "Those prosecutors have no clue what child pornography actually means," and added that the sequences weren't made to be arousing in any way, but to depict the pure horror and brutality of innocence being ruthlessly defiled. Fair point, but still the film is too extreme for most people, including me. Coming in at 5, I Spit on Your Grave. Released in 1979 and directed by Miyazaki, I Spit on Your Grave is a rape and revenge horror film that tells the story of Jennifer Hills, a writer based in New York City who exacts revenge on each of her tormentors after 4 men gang rape her and leave her for dead. The movie is a violent slice of horror that was unsurprisingly met with fierce opposition upon its release. Critics such as Roger Ebert refer to it as, I quote, "a vile bag of garbage without a shred of artistic distinction, and attending it was one of the most depressing experiences of my life." He also went on to call it so sick, reprehensible, and contemptible, and he could barely believe it existed. However, it wasn't just movie critics who hated the movie, entire countries did as well. Canada initially banned the film, however they later allowed individual provinces to decide if it would be allowed within their borders during the 1990s. The UK would only allow the movie to be released in censored form, meaning severe cuts, whereas countries such as Norway, Iceland, and West Germany, at the time, banned it outright on the premise that it supported violence against women. However, stranger still, the movie was only banned in Australia 20 years after its release. The ban was rescinded in 2004, however, but not all countries were as lenient, with the film still remaining banned in Ireland to this day. Coming in at 4, Snuff. Released in 1976 and directed by Michael Finley, Snuff is a splatter film that is most notorious for being marketed as if it were an actual snuff film. The plot itself revolves around actress Terry London and her producer Max Marsh, who visit an unnamed country in South America. A female biker cult led by a man named Satan stalks and eventually murders the pregnant London and her circle of friends. The movie is very Manson family-esque before quickly switching gears and becoming a documentary of a young woman being killed by the film's crew. Now, this movie actually has an interesting backstory. Michael Finley went down to Argentina to shoot a quick and dirty movie that would ultimately cash in on the helter-skelter craze, titling it Slaughter. However, the movie was unreleasable, but the then distributor Alan Shackleton had the idea of filming a fake killing, tacking it on the end of the movie and creating rumors that this was the real deal, a real snuff film. So to double down on the urban legend, they renamed the movie Snuff, and then hired fake protesters to picket in front of theatres. It eventually got to the point that the New York's district attorney considered prosecuting a theatre owner who was showing it. However, Variety were the first to expose the movie and its publicity stunts as hoaxes.
This is the true story of 4 innocent young actresses who thought they were making just another movie, but didn't know they were making the ultimate movie.
Coming in at number 3, Traces of Death. Released in 1993 and directed by Damon Fox, Traces of Death is a Z-Movie Mondo shockumentary that consists of various scenes of stock footage depicting death and real scenes of violence. Unlike the movie Faces of Death, which included fake deaths and reenactments, Traces is for the most part real and consists of public domain footage depicting death and injury. As you would expect, the movie was met with rejection all across the globe, and in 2005 the BBFC refused to give the first film an age certificate, effectively banning it. They deemed the movie to have no journalistic, educational or other justifying content for the images shown, while also suggesting that the film could potentially breach the UK laws under the Obscene Publications Act. The entire series has been subject to confiscation by customs authorities in Australia, and according to the country's regulations, I quote, "They offend against the standards of morality, decency and propriety generally accepted by reasonable adults to the extent that they should not be imported." Honestly, this film is absolutely disgusting and should never be watched. Coming in at 2, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Released in 1986 and directed by John McNaughton, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is a psychological horror about the random crime spree of a serial killer who seemingly operates with impunity. The film was, as expected, quite controversial. In the UK, the film has had a long and complex relationship with our friends the BBFC, with them refusing certification for many years. Now, the film's production company didn't even want to give the movie a theatrical release, which is a surprise, leaving the director to personally send out screener copies to critics in hopes of drumming up buzz. However, no one was willing, simply because the MPAA gave the movie an X rating, which at the time was mostly reserved for porno films. The film has heavy violence, which actually aided in the creation of the NC-17 rating, a distinction for movies with extreme content that don't quite cross the line into porn. But you may be asking, what happened to the film in Australia and New Zealand? Well, the film was originally outright banned by the film censor in 1992. A censored version was subsequently released on home video with cuts to the family massacre sequence, and was released on DVD in 2005.
Look at the world. It's either you or them. You know what I mean.
And finally, coming in at number 1, The Last House on the Left. Released in 1972 and directed by the legendary Wes Craven, The Last House on the Left is an exploitation horror film that revolves around 2 teenage girls who were taken into the woods and tortured by a gang of murderous thugs. Now, this movie was actually Craven's directorial debut and was loosely inspired by Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, and in turn received vicious censoring, resulting in it being banned in certain countries for decades. The film was explicit, particularly the torture scene, and therefore the United Kingdom refused a certificate for cinema release by the BBFC in 1974 due to the scenes of sadism and violence. The film was ultimately banned throughout the remainder of the 1980s and into the 1990s. However, after a series of major cuts, the movie is now available for viewing. That itself didn't happen until 2008. To top it off, no one even bothered to attempt to distribute it in Australia due to the monumental problems it would have caused. It actually wasn't even released down under until 2004. How crazy is that? The New York Times critics, Howard Thompson, even admitted to walking out after just 50 minutes of this sickening tripe. Fun fact for you all, when it was no longer banned, my parents bought it for me. Merry Christmas. Coming in at number 5, Possession. Directed by Andrzej Zulawski and released in 1981, Possession follows the relationship between an international spy and his wife, who begins exhibiting increasingly disturbing behavior after asking for a divorce. Possession is an international co-production between France and West Germany at the time, and was filmed in Berlin in 1980. The film went on to debut at the Cannes Film Festival, where Adjani won the award for Best Actress for her performance. However, not all critics agreed. Reviewing the movie after its screening at the San Francisco International Film Festival, Wayman Wong panned the movie as a sick and violent piece of trash. Savage. After an initial limited theatre release in the United Kingdom, the film was banned as one of the notorious video nasties, although it was later released uncut on VHS and DVD in 2000, 20 years after the film's initial release. Absolutely insane. In the years following its release, Possession has acquired a cult following, with folks deeming it, I quote, one of the most enigmatic and uncompromising horror movies in the history of cinema. I don't agree, but to each their own. Coming in at number 4, The Evil Dead. Directed by Sam Raimi and released in 1981, The Evil Dead tells the story of 5 friends who travel to a remote cabin in the woods, where they play a tape with incantations. This in turn releases the demons, which possess them in succession until one is left fighting for survival. Like all of the movies on our list, the release was met with controversy due to Raimi making the movie as gruesome as possible, with neither interest in nor fear of censorship, which led to the movie receiving an X rating and being named a video nasty. Films with this label were typically violent and disturbing, and the rating was often held by pornographic and other X-rated films. Of course, The Evil Dead is not pornographic, however it is considered to be one of the most violent movies of its time, with it even being dubbed #1 nasty. The movie was banned in Germany, Iceland, Finland, Ukraine, Singapore and other countries upon its release, and it was also one of the very first films deemed a video nasty. The Evil Dead is one of the most notorious splatter films of its day, along with some previous mentions including Cannibal Holocaust and I Spit on Your Grave. The film was and is still banned either theatrically or on video in a lot of countries, which is insane. Not a lot of people know that. Coming in at 3, A Clockwork Orange. Directed by the legendary Stanley Kubrick, one of my all-time favorites, and released in 1971, A Clockwork Orange follows Alex, a psychopathic delinquent who is imprisoned for murder and rape. In order to reduce his sentence though, he volunteers for an experimental therapy conducted by the government, but it goes askew. Now the film as a whole employs disturbing violent images to comment on psychiatry, juvenile delinquency, youth gangs and other social, political and economic subjects in a dystopian Britain. Now, although the movie received critical acclaim and was nominated for several awards including an Academy Award, the movie was met with backlash and controversy. In the United States, the movie was given an X rating, resulting in the movie undergoing 30 seconds of sexually explicit cuts to obtain an R rating and have a re-release the following year. Because of the explicit sex and violence, the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures rated it C, meaning condemned, a rating which forbade Roman Catholics seeing the film. Now, although the movie was passed uncut for UK cinema in December 1971, British authorities considered the sexual violence in the movie to be too extreme, and during the trial of a 14-year-old male accused of manslaughter of a classmate, the prosecutor referred to A Clockwork Orange, suggesting that the film had a macabre relevance to the case. The press also blamed the film for a rape in which the attackers sang Singing in the Rain, something that occurs in the movie. The film was ultimately withdrawn from British release in 1973. It was only after Kubrick died in 1999 that the film was theatrically re-released and made available for sale. Fun fact, it was actually filmed at my university. The more you know. Coming in at number 2, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Directed by Tobe Hooper and released in 1974, this iconic horror movie would be banned all over the world almost immediately upon its release. The movie follows Sally, Franklin, and their 3 friends who run out of gas while driving to their grandfather's house, and one by one they are tormented and killed by a chainsaw-wielding killer and his psychopathic family. Now, controversy began almost instantly, with the film being marketed as being based on true events in order to attract a wider audience and to act as a subtle commentary on the era's political climate. It was reported that Hooper hoped that the MPAA would give the complete uncut release print a PG rating due to its minimal amount of visible gore. Instead, it was rated X, which was originally only assigned to pornos. However, after several cuts it received an R rating. After its initial release in Britain, the movie was banned on the advice of BBFC Secretary Stephen Murphy. While the ban was enforced, the word chainsaw itself was also barred from movie titles, forcing imitators to rename their films. In San Francisco, cinemagoers walked out of theaters in disgust, and in February 1976, 2 theaters in Ottawa, Canada were advised by local police to withdraw the film lest they face morality charges. By the end of its cinema run, the movie was effectively banned in the UK, Brazil, Australia, West Germany, Chile, Iceland, Ireland, Norway, Singapore and Sweden. However, that aside, as one of the first slasher films, it is credited with giving birth to a number of horror tropes, and is by far one of the most influential horror movies of all time. And finally, coming in at number 1, The Exorcist. Directed by William Friedkin and released in 1973, The Exorcist of course tells the tale of a young girl named Reagan who inadvertently summons the demon Pazuzu, who possesses the young girl and tortures her until an exorcism can be performed. The film was one of that year's highest grossing movies, surprisingly, considering the controversy surrounding it. Audience members walked out, some fainted, vomited and others cried and screamed when the film was unleashed upon the world. To quote Newsweek on February 2nd, 1974, "On December 26th, a movie called The Exorcist opened in theaters across the country, and since then, all hell has broken loose." The movie grossed $1.9 million in its first week, setting house records in each theater. Now, what initially caused some controversy was the angiography scene in which a needle is inserted into Reagan's neck and blood spurts out. A procedure Friedkin states was actually performed on camera, with many critics calling it a needless seen, and genuinely disturbing. The movie was released in London on March 14, 1974, and was instantly met with protest around the UK by the nationwide Festival of Light, a Christian public action group concerned with the influence of media on society, in particular the young. The protests involved members of the local clergy and citizens handing out leaflets to those queuing to see the film, offering spiritual support for those who asked for it. Now, the film was available on home video in the early 80s, however, due to the film's notoriety, young viewers began to seek it out, of course, resulting in all copies being withdrawn from the UK in 1986, remaining unavailable for purchase until 1999, effectively banning the movie.